And here we go. Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II discussion forum series. It's actually our last lecture for the summer semester. And last but not least, and I think a fantastic way to go out is our speaker today. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. In the meantime, I'm going to put a link to our speaker's book in the chat for everyone to take a look at it. It's a fantastic book. I mean, the reviews alone are pretty staggering. So I think you're really going to enjoy today's talk. Again, we're going to go ahead and get started in about 30 seconds. I still see some people logging into Zoom. Link to the book on Amazon is in the chat, and just be a little patient. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone, by the way.
Oh, and we are recording for the Inevitable YouTube channel for those people who keep suggesting it. I will make sure it's a priority. For those who are interested, this is also our 90-second talk, so I appreciate everyone's support. Uh, we'll
How
get
long have you been going, Gregory?
September of 2023. And yeah, about a year and a half. And
Yeah,
it's
you've packed a lot in then.
I'm sorry.
You've packed a lot of talks in
Oh
then.
my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Everyone tells me too many, and then each semester I pack more into it. It's the flywheel effect on steroids. But what's funny is my first talk, and I know we're live and this is being recorded, but my first talk, the speaker never showed up. So I was like, wow, it can only get better from here. And it has. It really
Yeah,
has.
brilliant.
We've been so fortunate with the audience and the speakers and the quality of the talks. And on that note, I am going to go ahead and get started. So, first of all, thank you for everyone joining us today to hear Jack speak on his book. Before I introduce him, I'm going to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speakers graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either type your question into the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker. Or if you're feeling more adventurous, you can use the raised hand feature, and I will unmute your line and ask you to ask your questions to the speaker. Regardless of the method you choose, please be respectful with respect to content, time, whatever. Make sure to answer the question. And, as you guys know, we get a lot in the queue. So if more crisp, the better. We're going to go to about 2 p.m. New York time. I should say our speaker is actually coming back next week for an encore performance. So if we don't get to any questions today, we will definitely cover them next week. Second, donations are always appreciated, but never expected. I did get a very fabulous donation earlier this week, and I'm going to call that individual out very soon. And then third and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org. Now to our speaker this afternoon. Jack Bowsher has always had a passion for history. His grandfather did his national service in the late 40s, driving Sexton self-propelled guns under NCOs who were veterans of the Second World War. He passed on the stories of these men alongside war films, model kits, and visits to historical places. Jack and his grandfather, inspired by A Bridge Too Far, dragged the whole family to the Netherlands to drive Hell's Highway from Eindhoven to Arnhem. That sounds like a book in itself. Now a passionate military historian, Jack is dedicated to sharing his love of history with others. As a teacher and head of history in Herefordshire Secondary School, he is inspiring the next generation of historians. In 2023, Jack achieved a distinction in his military history MA, which secured his first book deal with, I'm going to mispronounce this, Chilesbury Publishing,
Chiselbury.
Chisselberry, which is today's book, Forgotten Armor, Tank Warfare in Burma. Jack has spoken at many productions, including We Have Waves Festival in 23 and 24, Tank Fest in 2025. That sounds like one I want to be involved with. Numerous podcasts, live streams, and YouTube channels. I will say Robert Lyman, who is no stranger to this group and highly respected, very much give a very glowing endorsement to Jack's book, as have many others, which you'll read in a minute. In October of 2024, he was elected to be an associate fellow of the Royal History Society. And at the end of 2024, he founded the Forgotten War podcast, Burma Campaign in World War II, with his co-host, Dr. Robert Lyman. Jack's going to talk to us about his first book today, and then his next book next week. It's a little unusual, but it's a wonderful sequence and wonderful history. Today's book is Forgotten Armor, Tank Warfare in Burma, which offers a new appraisal of the role of tanks in India and Burma in the Second World War. Often regarded primarily as an infantrymen's war in dense jungle and through monsoon conditions, the book shows that was far from the case. The reviews are staggering. I mean, I'll just read you a few. James Holland, superbly researched and compellingly told. Patrick Caddick Adams, quote, the employment of British armored vehicles in Burma deserves to be better known. Jack's story of ordinary tank soldiers doing extraordinary things in inhospitable terrain fills this gap. There is no doubt Forgotten Armour, with its tank troopers, quite literally sped up Allied success. This will be standard reading for decades to come. And then Robert Lyman just has a wonderful glowing comment. It really is a brilliant performance from a newcomer and highly worth reading for anyone interested in this period. And with that, I will turn it over to Jack.
Yeah, wow, thank you, Greg. That's really kind of you to sort of drop all that in. Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, it's a pleasure as well, because now Rob Lyman's been a real supporter of mine. For him to agree to do the podcast and so on, really, really fantastic. Sort of, he's been doing this for 30 years, and I've been doing it for a couple of years. And that's probably the best way to sort of begin this, with my inspiration to do this. And it was reading some of the books you can get on the Burma campaign, where they referred to things like, the Battle of Kohima, which we'll talk about in a little bit, one of the most famous battles in the Burma campaign in the Second World War. And sort of one of the things that those books talk about is they talk about the initial siege, then they talk about the battle that follows, and the tennis court in particular, an amazing place. Like I said, we'll talk about it a bit more later. But after sort of 39 days, the tennis court is cleared when they get a tank up there. And kind of that's just all the books ever said. And that sort of piques my interest with the things like my granddad's involvement with tracked vehicles. It made me want to know more about what the story was behind that just a tank came along and then the tennis court was cleared at Kohima. So yeah, that was my sort of inspiration of what was really going on with these tanks. And again, just also seeing fantastic pictures like this one, so sort of the old and new meeting in the middle of this battle. This is one of the tanks of the Deccan Horse, who we'll talk about perhaps next week, actually. So let's get going. Greg mentioned this just now. So one of the sort of cliches that we have of the Burma campaign is images like these. So bottom left, you've got one of the Chindit columns. You've got guys in the two right-hand photographs. They're in thick jungle or scrub jungle in this case. On the left, you've got men struggling in the monsoon to get supplies over the sort of the geographical features of Burma, which I'll mention in a sec. And this is not wrong. I'm not saying this is wrong. It's just that it simplifies and limits the story of what Burma, the campaign, is truly like. So to sort of begin, as lots of people don't know what the sort of the map of Burma is when it comes to the Second World War, the Burma campaign, and so on. So I like to have this particular picture in here that shows a number of the different key locations. So people might recognize Kohima and Imphal at the top left over the border inside India, Mandalay, Mektila, Rangoon to the south, and also places like Sinswaya, which is where the admin box is. Really, really important place for that particular battle. But there are also some key sort of regions that I'm just going to point out. So there's the Irrawaddy Valley. And to the right is the Sitang Valley, but the Irrawaddy Valley is sort of the key one for most of the war. The Central Dry Belt. Now, this is unlike the rest of Burma, and you can tell from the image here, this is not the jungle that you think of. There's the Chin Hills. You've got Assam and Manipur, so where Imphal and Kohima are. And if you look very carefully in the area around Imphal, this is important for later, the area around Imphal itself is also not really jungle in the way that you see in the mountains around it, because Imphal is a plain in like a sort of a dip in the mountains. And also then there's the Arakan in the sort of the western coastal region, places like the Admin Box, Dombike, Ramri, and so on. So let's jump straight into the story of Forgotten Armour, the sort of the role that tanks played, that I think we should all take as part of the story in general. So the map on the left here is basically the previous map, but I've put the arrows of the 7th Armoured Brigade. Now, at the beginning of the war, the 7th Armoured Brigade were in North Africa. They fight for a couple of years against first the Italians, then the Germans, the Afrika Korps. And they are very, very successful, considering how bad it was for the British in 1942 in particular, first half of that in North Africa. And other problems as well. 1940 is not always great. It's a sort of ding-dong battle in the desert. 7th Armoured Brigade are part of the 7th Armoured Division, and they are detached to be reinforcements to Singapore, but Singapore falls when they're still on the boat, and so they're sent to Burma instead. And the key thing about the 7th Armour Brigade is that the situation is already lost. So if those of you on here know the Burma campaign well, you'll know that one of the locations I've included in the map is the Sitang Bridge. Now, the Sitang Bridge was blown a few days before the 7th Armour Brigade arrived, and really, because that blowing of the bridge with 2/3 of a division on the wrong side of it, lots of casualties, lots of Japanese took lots of prisoners. Kind of Rangoon was already lost. If you're the Japanese traveling towards Rangoon from the Sitang Bridge, you could surround the entire British and Indian army in Rangoon. So the British Indian Command, as Slim and Alexander, the two generals who take command in this period, they abandon Rangoon. They know that they'll be surrounded and bottled up and destroyed if they stay there, and they know they're going to have to withdraw. So the Sitang Bridge disaster kind of meant that Rangoon was already lost. So 7th Armored Brigade arrived too late to necessarily win the whole first campaign. What they do that's so important is that they allow the infantry units to break contact with the Japanese and withdraw in good order. And so sort of the key thing for those that don't know is the Japanese were very, very good in this particular campaign, but they use it in other places, in using things like jungle to get behind the British and Indian troops, because they relied too much on wheeled transport and tracked vehicles as well in the case of tanks. They're too tied to those roads. The Japanese find it very, very easy to use the jungle to encircle and then get behind. And that happens multiple times throughout the battle. It happens just south of Peigu. It happens near the place called Taochan, Shuidong, Yananyang. All of these places involve Japanese encirclements. And it's usually, Taochan is the bigger outlier in this, but most of these particular operations, the British are using their tanks to charge through these roadblocks. For example, at Shuidong, there's a 2-day battle, running battle through the town and the surrounding area, pushing through roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, including night fighting and that sort of thing. Bear in mind how difficult night fighting is in a tank. I mean, luckily, the burning buildings and so on provide light for the fighting for the tank men who have to open their hatches and so on. But the key thing here is that the men here who are taking these little Stuart tanks that are already or pretty much obsolete in the desert, borderline in the middle of early 1942 when this happens. They're going to be overwhelmed or outmatched in the Western theatres very soon after this. But they're very, very successful. They're very reliable at doing this job. And for example, this is another picture that's at Yananyang. So these are Chinese troops and these are Chinese nationalist troops. So the modern day successor state would be Taiwan rather than the communist China. And they fight through this battlefield around these oil derricks in one of the oil regions, and this is really sandy but hilly territory. This is more like desert. There's no jungle here, and they fight in 40-degree heat here. But what happens is the tanks of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, alongside the Chinese 38th Division, they counterattack the Japanese at the crucial moment, and they then allow the surrounded troops here to break out of their own encirclement with another part of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. It's really important to remember this entire 1942 campaign is really, really confusing, and lots of shifting sort of movements. Priorities change in the middle of sort of battles and operations. At one point, another attempt at a counterattack turns into a rescue mission because the unit gets cut off, and all these sorts of things. So it's a really, really difficult sort of confusing series of battles through these months. And eventually it leads to, I like to also use Google Maps to try and, I'm not in the position to go to modern day Myanmar because it's particularly dangerous. So I can't go to these places, and especially this region in particular. But this is the bit of the Chindwin River that the British and Indian troops retreat to and then cross over. And at first, they're at the little basin by the dried up river at Shuigin at the bottom, and they're taking ferries along this river to Kalewa. But the Japanese eventually close in. They have to abandon Shuigin. And the big problem they have here is that Shuigin was the last place they could reasonably be expected to rescue the tanks, because they could have got them on the boats there and then unload them at Kalewa. There was no other place where it was set up for them to do this. And so they end up having to, just north of Shuiyin, in the sort of the hills just above it, they have to smash the tanks up. And this was weirdly moving thing to research, because the soldiers talked about how they had to, they're using sledgehammers to smash up the radios and the guns, so the guns are all bent, throwing all the some crucial equipment into the river. They pour petrol into them and set fire to some of them. A lot of them, what they do is they drain all the engine oil, and then they run the engine until the lack of lubricant basically eats the engine up. And some of them comment about how the tanks didn't want to die. They took ages for the engines to seize up and that sort of thing. Like they were they wanted to be rescued, and interesting how people like Slim, he mentions this sort of thing, that it was how sad they felt to abandon them because of how much work they'd done. But it has a slightly happy ending, because one tank gets away, which then goes on to join the 7th Light Cavalry, called the Curse of Scotland. The turret is removed, it becomes a sort of reconnaissance and command vehicle, but it does return to Burma in 1945. And the original driver, a guy called Alan Barber, I talk about him in the book, who got it out in 1942. He moves to Australia after the war, and he calls this tank his Burmarang, because it went back to Burma. Sort of one of those lovely little things. But anyway, guys, there's loads that I want to get through. So let's carry on then to Arakan. This is a very famously very soggy, very wet region, not just the monsoon, but also where it's coastal. So it's quite heavy jungle in a lot of places, although there is some rice paddy, which is relatively good for tank country. And also it has lots of inlets and creeks that make the ground quite sandy and marshy. And so in that respect, whilst there are some open spaces on the paddy, it is very treacherous for tanks. And in 1943, so we've gone from 1942, we've gone into 1943 now. The Arakan campaign, the first one, is one of the big blunders for the British in the Second World War. The commanders there don't really know how to fight the Japanese. They treat it like a First World War battle. They also give a lot of notice. They move at a very plodding pace, building a road behind them. So the Japanese get to both build better defensive positions, now they know the attack's coming, and also they send some reinforcements. And they come to a particular place called Don Bike, and the Chung just north of it. And again, I've used Google Maps here to plot all these places. And the Japanese had built a series of bunkers in the hills just to the right of the Don Bike Chung, and also along the length of it down to the beaches. There's mountains over to the east, to the right-hand side of this image, that were reasonably difficult. Well, they were difficult for tanks to pass, and even for infantry. The classic thing in the first half of the war against Japan, the mistake the British make is, oh, well, that jungle is impenetrable. And they're wrong. They make that mistake in 1942 and in 1943. But anyway, what happens is the commander here, Noel Irwin, who is one of the real bad guys, really, of the Burma campaign, because he sidelines Slim. So he's Slim's boss, Bill Slim, will be the famous commander of 14th Army. At this point, he's still a corps commander. His army commander basically pushes him aside and takes over this operation, even though it should be Slim's. It's his corps that's doing the fighting. So Slim gets pushed back to India to do some training and prep. And what happens is Irwin calls up when he's banging his head against the wall of the position here, because they're really good bunkers. They're sort of 5 feet deep, log bunkers, lots of earth on top, very well camouflaged, difficult to spot. And they decide that they keep attacking them, they keep failing. They do it like First World War battlefields, walking across. You can see the sort of the rice paddies in the image. They walk across these places underneath the machine guns and artillery of the Japanese. Obviously, there's artillery further back and in the jungle. And they keep having loads of casualties. So Irwin demands to send 2 troops, so that's 6 tanks, plus they have another couple of command vehicles, so 8 tanks in total. Slim immediately protests. He tells Irwin, you need to take the whole regiment. Don't mess around with a couple of troops. You need to overwhelm the enemy. And Irwin basically tells Slim to get back in his box, to shut up, because he's the army commander. Slim, know your place. I want 8 tanks. We can't have any more. The logistics are too difficult. Later, that's proven complete nonsense by the amount of tanks they bring up afterwards. And Irwin sends them into this fight with absolutely no kind of reconnaissance at all. 3 of them get stuck in the river itself. They actually fall into the river. They overdrive themselves. They get stuck, and all 9 of the crewmen across the 3 tanks that get trapped, all 9 of them are killed. The other 5 tanks get away basically without doing any damage whatsoever. And the Japanese are happy as Larry. They have no any sort of problem here. And one of the things the Japanese have done over the course of the weeks and couple of months that this has happened, including this battle in 1943 with the tanks, they have used their infantry to get through the jungle that the British think is impassable, get behind them, and then they have to do another embarrassing retreat like in 1942. Lots of casualties, lots of prisoners fall into Japanese hands. It's a complete debacle. The 2 big positives, well, 3 big positives. Firstly is Slim will replace, through a bit of political movement, but Slim will replace Irwin as the army commander, and they'll rename it 14th Army to break the old Eastern Army. So the Eastern Army has the whiff of failure now. So it's renamed 14th Army, like following the naming convention of like 8th Army in North Africa. Slim is put in command. The second thing is that whilst tanks had not done well at Dombike, their performance in 1942 and Slim's advocacy meant that the British finally sent medium tanks, and we'll get to those medium tanks in a moment. And the third big thing is that Slim is able to now do, and I suppose this is kind of like the first point addition really, Slim is able to put all of his training ideas into place about making the jungle your friend, use overwhelming force in the right places, don't penny pack it like the Irwin had done with the Valentine tanks. Now, I said that they get medium tanks. So the tank they get is the M3 medium in American things, so stopgap design. The M4 Sherman is in the middle of being designed, but they haven't finished. In particular, the turret for the Sherman hasn't yet been designed and finished and finalized. And so what they do is they take an old M2 tank that never really saw combat. They took the design of the M2, they put in a 75mm sponson on the right hand side, and they put in a turret that's not dissimilar from the Stuart tank. Not the same, but similar, has the same gun in it, for example, the 37mm on the top. Now, the British like to have the radio up in the turret with the commander. They're also conscious of manpower problems, being a much smaller population. So whilst they take the Lee straight away because they're ready to go, they do want the Grant turret eventually, which they've already been in discussions with the Americans with. And so what you find is the first 2 regiments in the Burma campaign who are ready to go, the 25th Dragoons and the 3rd Carabiniers, they get the Lees. The 149th and 150th Royal Armoured Corps, they receive Grant tanks because they've arrived later than the 25th Dragoons and 3rd Carabiniers. So just to recap the differences, because this is the kind of thing, the mistake you see on the internet all the time. The Lee is the 7-man crew. The radio operator is sitting in the front of the tank next to the driver, whereas the Grant tank has the different turret, sort of blister coming out the back, 6-man crew. The radio operator is gone, and the tank commander has it in the turret. Now, they were supposed to be the commander who used the radio, but the commander usually delegated it to the loader of the gun rather than doing it himself. They passed it on to someone else because they were so busy. But anyway, let's get into 1944 now. So one last thing I'll say, Slim's training in 1943 is essentially to prepare the 14th Army to go on offensive action. Now, the thing they learned at the First Arakan Dombike was how good the Japanese bunkers were. And the tank is the perfect solution because you can drive it up pretty close and it won't be machine gunned. Obviously, anti-tank fire is a little bit different. A crucial thing I've not mentioned that I should, though, is Japanese anti-tank weapons were not very good. You know, a picture I showed earlier was of the Japanese destroying one with Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs. This is a tank that was damaged by anti-tank fire, but then finished off with petrol bombs, because the Japanese anti-tank guns they're good enough against Stuarts, but against medium tanks, the Lees, the Grants, the 37mm, 47mm guns that the Japanese use in the anti-tank role are not good enough. One of the reasons why they want it. So they can bring these tanks pretty close, 30, 40 meters from an enemy bunker, and then they can hit it with 75mm gunfire, so HE, high explosive guns first, shells first, and then armor piercing as the infantry close in. And they come up with this drill, they train it with the infantry, using this kind of fire from the tank as the cover fire from very close range. And then by the time the infantry are 10 yards away, they can make the final dash and finish off that bunker. And training is one thing. They need to put it into practice. And the first opportunity they get is the Battle of the Admin Box. And I love this picture because this is taken from the hills overlooking the sort of the paddy fields that the Japanese were trying to cross to destroy it. Now, for those that don't know, the Admin Box gets its name because it was the headquarters of the 7th Indian Division. So it wasn't one of the rifle brigades, or in the American parlance, the rifle regiments, the infantry regiments. It was this was the divisional headquarters. So it had things like all the mule transport was based here. It had workshops. It had a hospital. It had like a vehicle park by the workshop. And so they rushed some infantry battalions in, and in particular, they rush the 25th Dragoons into the box. And so they want to use the firepower of the tanks to defend the box. So here it is. This is it on a map. So it's over on the western side. It's it's Sinzwea. And the plan of the Japanese here is to strike into that tiny little bottom bit of India. Now it's Bangladesh. So attack Chittagong, which is just over the border in India from where the admin box is. And that will be a distraction. The idea is that the Japanese will send reinforcements from Kohima and Imphal over to the admin box. And that's a distraction because again, those of you that know the campaign well, you will know that a month after the admin box, the Japanese invade India at Imphal and Kohima. So we have to remember this. The Battle of the Admin Box, as the British call it, Operation Hargo to the Japanese, that is designed to bring reinforcements from Imphal and Kohima to the Arakan so that Imphal and Kohima are weaker for the main attack that will follow. So let's get to the actual battle. This is a quirky little map that I made, again, using the 3D version of Google Maps. So there's a central hill, a small hill called Ammunition Hill. So you can see it in the cluster of trees just there on this particular image. You then have Artillery Hill, which is behind it on the other side of the little chung that runs through it, the dried up riverbed. And they basically lined up their tanks sort of either side of Ammunition Hill. It's then surrounded by hills on either side. So you have the 2nd West Yorks at the bottom right, the Nyokidoke Pass, so the soldiers called it the Okidoke Pass, that took you back to the coast. And they put the 2nd King's Own Scottish border as an artillery hill, and the 4th and 8th Gurkhas over on the far side. Now, the interesting thing about the 4th and 8th Gurkhas is they have a fantastic guy, and again, those of you that know the Burma campaign may have heard of him. There is an American called Scott Gilmore, who is a lieutenant in the 4th 8th Gurkhas, who he'd volunteered to be an ambulance driver in North Africa before Pearl Harbor. And then because he's in just as his year contract as one of the volunteer drivers, and he's at places like Tobruk, he's in Cairo sort of between sort of battles. His contract's about to come to an end. And because the Indian Army has a presence in Cairo, he sees an advert basically saying, are you a combat veteran? Do you want to be an officer in the Indian Army? So it was a way of getting more veteran soldiers who maybe in the British Army wouldn't have got that promotion. If they agree to go over to the Indian Army, they will get their commission and become an officer. And Scott Gilmore takes it. So he's one of the soldiers that actually fights this battle, and I recommend his memoir, Connecticut Yankee in the 8th Gurkhas. So a bit of a mouthful, but a book well worth sourcing. You can get it; it's not particularly rare. So yeah, Scott Gilmore's for Connecticut Yankee in the 8th Gurkhas. But anyway, back to the tanks. So what you have is they use the tanks in the admin box in the way that Slim wants them to. They're doing bunker busting, finding Japanese bunkers in the daytime and destroying them to push them off the hills around the admin box. At night, it's a little bit different. They fire in fixed lines across the paddy fields to the left of this map. Frank Messervy, by the way, is the commander. I've just put him there. He had been captured briefly in the North African campaign at Gazala and has escaped. He nearly gets captured again during this battle when he's surrounded. There is a myth that he was in his pajamas, but that is a lie. When you look at all of the records at the time, he wasn't. He was started in his pajamas and got changed before he made his escape. Anyway, I'm going to brush through this very, very quickly. but I have got some film footage taken just after the ammunition of the box, showing the 25th Dragoons providing the fire support. So they're shooting into the hills and mountains. They've got people spotting them. And then the infantry, when they get the signal, then charge over the crest of the hills to then attack the bunker that the tank has been shooting at from the far side. This is a very famous piece of footage, this one. You see this in the covers of books and so on. But anyway, I'll skip that a little bit because time is short, I know. So after the Battle of the Admin Box, the Japanese defeated, and they're defeated very quickly within about 4 weeks. So what ends up happening, much against the Japanese plans, the Admin Box battle, which we'll remember was supposed to be a distraction, ends up finishing so soon that when the Japanese attack Imphal and Kohima, the soldiers at the Admin Box, the 7th Indian Division and also the 5th Indian Division, are flown to Imphal and Kohima as reinforcements. So the Japanese plan ends up failing on that strategic level completely, because they end up like what should have been a distraction actually ends up being able to send reinforcements against their main effort, which was supposed to have a weaker garrison that they were facing. So let's get into the Battle of Imphal. So this is the classic map that you see. This was made for the official British history. We'll do Imphal first, then Kohima. So the important thing about this is that you'll see that the British, in the bottom left corner of the left-hand map, there's a 17 in a dash red line box. There's a 25, there's a 20. These are British divisions who were already fighting to get to the Chindwin River to invade Burma later in 1944. When they realized the Japanese are sending their own attack the opposite way, instead of fighting the Japanese in the jungles and mountains, which would give the Japanese infantry the advantage, Slim deliberately pulls back to the Imphal plain because he can use the flat ground as a way to send his advantage, particularly tanks, to wherever he needs to send them, which is what he does brilliantly. The 17th Indian Division at the southern end, they nearly get cut off. It's the tanks of the 17th, 16th light infantry, light cavalry that help bring them out, for example. Here's another map of the plain. So the tanks get sent to all sorts of different corners. So C Squadron of the 3rd Carabiniers, this is the regiment that are fighting here, they go up to Kangla to Lion Box. B Squadron are sort of the top right-hand corner. They will famously fight at Nunshigam. A Squadron of the 7th Light Cavalry, sorry, I said 16th, it's the 7th Light Cavalry, bottom left-hand corner. And also A Squadron go to the bottom right through sort of the Palel area towards Tamu. And so these are sort of the different dispositions, but Slim will move these tanks around. They don't stay there. Like a sort of fire brigade, answering the call, they will go to wherever they're needed. So this is a particular photograph that shows you Kangla is just to the right-hand side out of the way, and C Squadron patrol from Sekmai, which is at the top of this image, and they clear the Japanese from Kangla in a very, very attritional fight. They go into Kangla in Lion Box, they clear it of the Japanese, then withdraw. Then a couple of days later, they do the same thing again. And each time they're destroying the Japanese as a force, as a fighting force. There's a really famous battle here called Nunshigam as well. Now, I should say the photo at the top left is not of Nunshigam, but it shows you what they were doing. Nunshigam is 3,000 feet high. It is a long way off the ground. Well, it's 1,000 feet off the ground, I should say. It's 3,000 above sea level, 1,000 feet high. And it's a razorback ridge along most of its length. You could only get one tank in a line. The thing that was important about Nunshigam was it was only 8 miles from Imphal and the airfields and so on, because Imphal is surrounded by the Japanese, and so they're relying on aerial resupply, planes landing on the airfields. And what they have to do is, if the Japanese kept this mountain at Nunshigam, they would have been able to have fired artillery accurately on the resupply bases, and so therefore cut off the garrison and hopefully starve them. So they had to take Nunshigam back. So they send up 8 tanks, so 2 troops, go up from B Squadron. They have artillery firing from either side and tanks firing from either side up onto the mountainside. And the infantry of the 17th Dogras go with them. And the crazy thing happens is it's such a close battle. The Japanese are so physically close to the tanks that what happens is, and this isn't a joke, the eight tanks, every single one of them lose their commander, most of them killed by a small arms fire into their heads, because that's the only bit of their body that's out. A lot of them are using their own, well, more of them is out, I suppose, but a lot of them are using their own Tommy guns and grenades to attack the infantry, like Japanese infantry, to defend themselves. They're using their own small arms to defend the tanks as they go single file along this ridge to clear it of Japanese positions. And I've got a picture on the bottom left. This is Sergeant Craddock. He's the sergeant that takes over the operation when all the officers have been killed. And him and his opposite number, because it's important, the Dogras also lose their officers. And so Craddock here and an Indian NCO, between the two NCOs, they finish the job. It's one of those battles that we should know about on the small unit level, because it's a really, really brave and difficult battle. B squadron also, B and A and C squadron also fight further south at a place called Bishanpur. This is like more fighting in sort of villages, and this is a real picture of the area at a place called Nintukong. And this is like house to house, and to be honest, they flatten most of these villages, but it's much flatter territory here, so it's more like an open battlefield, which again, it gives the British tanks something of an advantage, but it's quite attritional here. And I'm just going to point out the two pictures of the anti-tank guns. These are the kind of anti-tank guns that in 1939 were kind of becoming obsolete, and they're still using them. They continue to use the tanks. So by the time the monsoon starts, they're sending these tanks up the mountains as they're trying to get to Kohima. So Kohima was won a couple of weeks before, and the hands of Kohima and Imphal are trying to join up. But the Japanese are using the mountains either side of the roads to stop the roads from opening. And so they're using the Royal Engineers in particular, they're using bulldozers to tow tanks up, or they're building new roads. If you look very carefully, and again, the tankers in the room will maybe see this, you will see that this tank has got grousers fitted to the tracks, little extension bars that help grip into the mud. So that's kind of the Battle of Imphal, and I have massively skipped that very quickly, and I do apologise, but I do cover all of this in detail in Forgotten Armour for those that are interested. And again, afterwards, if you want me to go into a detail in the questions, I love the quick Q&A part of any of my talks. So do feel free to sort of submit them. So the final battle that I was going to talk about today is the Battle of Kohima. So this is probably the most famous battle of the Burma campaign, probably. I mean, I'm sure if you're interested in coming to this talk, you probably know more than the average person anyway. And so apologies if I sort of slightly repeat things you already know. But the Battle of Kohima probably is the most famous. Now, I have the awkward thing here of saying that because my book and my sort of my niche within the military history world is tank warfare, I slightly have to skip the really, really brave siege part, because the siege of Kohima, when the Japanese surround this little cluster of hills and occupy the mountains around it, the stand that they make, they're outnumbered. The British and Indian garrison is outnumbered by about 10-1, and they hold it for 16 days successfully. It's genuinely the real nail-biting stuff. And again, my podcast partner, Rob Lyman, is about to start his big book on Kohima, which I'm sure will be brilliant. I'm really excited to read that as well. But I'm going to have to skip the siege because there's no tanks involved. When the Japanese surround it, of course, the British, who are in command of the Indian Army, they bring forward their tanks as part of the relief effort. So the division is the 2nd British Division, so their British troops come to the rescue here. And the 149th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps. There's also 2 squadrons of the 150th Royal Armoured Corps, but they're slightly reserve and they're slightly more on the periphery of the battle. It's the 149th that get in amongst the hills around Kohima itself. So there's a couple of really, really famous stories. And again, if any of you are lucky enough to have been to Kohima, and I know lots of people do, Rob has led tours there, you will have seen this tank. And if you haven't been there and seen it, you probably have seen this tank in pictures and so on. So this took place in late 1944, after the siege was over and the battle to get rid of the Japanese in the area has begun. So late April 1944, this is Major Ezra Rhodes. He's the commander of B Squadron of 149th Royal Armoured Corps. And he basically is trying to attack Kuki Picket. And Garrison Hill, which is sort of the centre of the British position, he's basically driving between Garrison Hill and Kuki Picket to try and get up onto Kuki Picket and clear it. what happens is they slip down the hillside because the monsoon has started by this point. It came a couple of weeks earlier, in April in 1944. And so the mud on the ground is really, really difficult. And so the tank slips down the hillside and basically into a Japanese position. They start throwing grenades. They're trying to throw grenades in the hatches. They close down as quickly as they can. And eventually, though, they realize they're going to just have to make a run for it. So they call for support from another tank, gives them covering fire, and they all basically leg it out of the tank. They jump out suddenly and run towards friendly lines, and trying to use sort of the tank for cover. They run away from the Japanese in the lee of I'm talking naval in maritime terms, but like in the sort of the shadow of the tank. So they're running away from the Japanese towards friendly lines. It's also facing the wrong way to where they were traveling. If you visited there, it hit a tree and spun round as it slips down the mountain. But yeah, really, really interesting story that. And it was because Rhodes wrote a very detailed report, which is nail biting when they're in, like he talks about being inside the tank. He wrote that report a couple of weeks afterwards. It's not like he wrote a post-war memoir. It's in the National Archives, typed up on ancient, like now brown typewriter papers. It's really, really fantastic. Okay, one last thing as well is the Battle of the Tennis Court. So I thought I'd start the Battle of the Tennis Court by showing you a little bit of footage, again from the Imperial War Museum. You will notice that I've flipped the image. It will have numbers and stuff in reverse on the watermarks because they've uploaded the digital version to the Imperial War Museum the wrong way round for some reason. So I've flipped everything. So this is a really important guy, Clive Chettle. He commands the operation to take back the tennis court. This is the tennis court itself, sort of slightly to the left. There's about half the tennis court in view there. And what I'll do is, here you go. These are guys going over. Now, this is film footage that was taken when they're fighting below the tennis court, clearing the Japanese on the far side. Again, more of Clive Chettle. I'll skip him a little bit. So this is now what's left of the bungalow just below it. These were things like servants' quarters, that sort of thing. So I want you to take a sort of slight mental image of some of these places. Again, tennis court. This is Clive firing his revolver into a Japanese position. This is a thing called the Long Tin Shed. All these things. There's a note. There was the lamp. There was a Victorian lamppost. Again, Clive, cigarette in mouth, looking for the Japanese in one of the buildings, and so on. And then we get through to, there you go. There's the Victorian lamppost and that sort of thing. So what I wanted to get, here you go, that's the camera when they've used an explosive charge as well. And you also have footage of this tank. So this is the thing that inspired me really, is reading about what happened here. So this is the Grant tank of a man called Jerry Waterhouse. And I'm very, very, very blessed to know his daughter, who very kindly helped me with my research. Now, he is the tank commander. I'll go on to the next slide now. So this is clearing Kohima in general. And the tennis court is so important. It's so famous because basically it commands that main road that you can see on the map. That is the one that links the supply bases at Dimapur with Imphal. And here's Jerry Waterhouse on the bottom left. He's the one flicking the V for Victory sign, which in England in particular is a swear word, or a swear sign. It's like flicking the bird in America. He is, I think, if you're only going to remember one name from this talk, I want you to remember Jerry Waterhouse, because he is not particularly well known in this country, and certainly not therefore in America. And he should be the kind of person that we put in the same bracket as, say, Dick Winters or John Frost in Arnhem, that sort of thing, or Jim Gavin maybe, although they're more senior commanders mostly. He's your classic. He's a sergeant, so he's a non-commissioned officer. He's the kind of guy that takes responsibilities. He is given the job of dropping his tank onto the tennis court at Kohima to clear it. And obviously, the big thing about the tennis court is that it's because we can all picture a tennis court and what size it is, and the width of the tennis court the tennis court was no man's land basically. And apologies if the picture is quite small, the map. This is a map my wife actually drew, and I did the graphics for it. I always have to say that because I get in trouble if I don't. But she made this for me to just illustrate the attack. And you can see sort of like where Jerry Waterhouse's tank in the green in number 1 drops down. They then fire at the Japanese machine guns in the tennis court. The Japanese have a machine gun in the water tank. They have a machine gun at the end of the Long Tin Shed. And you can see where I said about the Long Tin Shed, the Victorian lamppost, the servants' quarters, and so on. you can see sort of hopefully what I was showing you in the video and some of the screenshots that I've given you here. So Jerry Waterhouse drops his tank down. Now, bear in mind that the fighting over the tennis court went on for 39 days, 16 days in the siege, hundreds of casualties, another 23 days clearing it. The last of those days is this one, which is the 13th of May 1944. And what Waterhouse does is, along with Clive Chettle and the 2nd Dorsets, which is the regiment that do this, they attack two-pronged. So the tank drops down onto the tennis court, opens fire on the machine gun positions. The two platoons of the 2nd Dorsets then rush the Japanese positions. They clear the tennis court area and the long tin shed first. They then drop the tank down by the servants' quarters. And where the tank is in the top left photo is when it's on that level. So that's sort of out of shot to the left of the tank there would be sort of the servants' quarters and so on, where they've come sort of slightly round round the quarters towards the district commissioner's bungalow, DC's bungalow. And it's all a complete wreck. It's all been flattened by artillery after previous days. And again, they're having to go from foxhole to foxhole, bunker to bunker, hand to hand. But the tanks are smashing those bunkers when the infantry approach, so that the Japanese are either actually killed by the tank fire or they're completely discombobulated by it, confused, suppressed, however you want to describe it. And so you have then the way that the Japanese eventually are driven off. And what's very unusual in this battle is they see the Japanese jump onto that main road and escape into the rather than staying and fighting to the death, they actually withdraw. They pull out over the road. And so, of course, the British on the hill overlooking this, the commanders, they call in artillery fire and hit them. But the interesting thing is, hundreds of casualties. The 2nd Dorsets, who have been fighting here for the 23 days after the initial siege, they've lost 75 dead men and 150 or so wounded in the fighting of those previous 3 days. On this day, the 13th of May 1944, when they introduce that tank, the tank is the only difference to the previous 39 days, okay, going back through the battle and the siege before that. This is the only time they bring in a tank. It's the only difference. They have 4 men wounded, 4, okay, and 1 man, Alfred Siggins, killed. So when you think about that, 39 days of carnage, the awful hand-to-hand fighting, the thing I always say, and this is a little bit crude, but I think it's an important one, soldiers talked about they could hear the other side defecating in their foxholes. That's how close they are, with the poor diets and so on. People are noisier when they do that sort of thing. That's how close physically we are talking. And they've all these casualties over all these weeks, and the one tank makes all of the difference. Now, in my book, I continue after the Battle of Kohima into 1945. But because of both time and the fact that I'm coming back next week to talk about my second book, which involves a lot of that. So my second book is Thunder on Mekitla 1945. What I'll do is I'll talk about the reconquest of Burma, Operation Capital, Operation Extended Capital, those sorts of things. I will speak about those next week. But yeah, that's basically Forgotten Armour up to 1945. But thank you so much for listening. I was trying to find a particular screen then that I thought I'd finish on. So where is it? Oh, there we go. So yeah, so these are my books. If you are interested, I also do the podcast. If you want to follow me on social media, basically all my social media and the podcast is at History Bowsher, at Forgotten War Pod. But Greg, so I think that's what I'll do for this week. And so I'd like to open it for questions. I can stay longer. I don't need to finish. Personally, I don't need to finish it in the next 10 minutes. I can stay longer if that's convenient.
No, that's great. I am actually in a hotel, so housekeeping may be the gating issue because I'm supposed to check out in 10 minutes, but this is
I don't mind Gregory carrying on if you need to check out.
No, I mean it's gotten to the point where the speakers have had to run it themselves.
I don't mind. I run a podcast, I've been doing these things. It's no problem at
all. You should give out the link to your podcast if you want to do that now, or I can send it around.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I can type in the message thing here, but yeah, I mean, just Google the Forgotten War podcast. You will find it on all the podcast apps if you're interested. But let's not waste time on plugging. People, I'm sure, have got questions, so please feel free to fire away.
I just want to thank Jane Rebel for her donation, and Reed Bennett as well. And in a complete coincidence, Reed has the first question. Great talk. 2 questions. On your Arakan slide, you showed 2 tanks. The front one had very unusual high clearance. What tank was that? You also mentioned 40 degrees C, 104 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. How hot was it in the tanks?
Well, the interesting thing about the design of both the Sherman and the Lee Grant is, and I'm not a mechanic. I'm not a mechanically minded person, but the engine, the air cooling system drew air through the tank. So if the commander had his hatch open, which he often did, actually cool air was dragged through. But I did mean 40 degrees centigrade. Sorry, that's me being British. Sorry, but yeah, it's the air coolant in the tank actually did drag a lot of it through. However, that doesn't mean it wasn't uncomfortable. So there were all sorts of things. When I did my research for it, I found a report on the I found a report on the experimental use of anti-flash cream, so flash fire cream, because all the crews were basically wearing their shorts and then nothing else, pretty much almost in their underwear, basically, because it was so hot. And they had this cream that they were basically smearing all over their exposed bits of the body, so that in a flash explosion, they wouldn't be horrifically burned and that sort of thing. It would give them a chance to get out before the burns got too much. But the crews stopped wearing it because they got so sweaty that it was then going into their eyes. They couldn't see, watering their eyes and that sort of thing. So it did get hot in there. It was uncomfortable. They talked about, the sweat bands of their shorts as well getting really, or the bands of their shorts and that getting really uncomfortable, the friction from them and the chafing and that sort of thing. So was hot, could have been hotter. Interestingly, Japanese tanks like Type 95 Hargo, they put in an air pocket between the armor plate. And people will notice in this talk, I've not talked about Japanese tanks very much. It's because there's A, not many of them, and B, they're not very well handled, and they almost always get destroyed the moment they meet another tank. So they don't destroy a single Allied tank in the whole
Fascinating.
campaign.
I see we have Jim and Mike. So Jim, I will call on you first to unmute your line and ask your question. And then Mike, I will go to you. Jim, you should be.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep.
Okay. Hey, very good job, Jack. Really terrific.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim, because I had to rush it. So.
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
It's very interesting because I once went to a conference in London about this, probably before you were born, and it was really interesting because it was, of course, the Forgotten War. But let me just ask you about the Japanese. Now, this theater, a lot of us here in the United States, we're familiar with the Burma campaign. So I'm just curious how the Japanese army is responding in that theater to the use of armor, how they factoring it in. Because I know a little bit about the Pacific, I know a little bit about China, but you're talking about the employment of a couple of battalions, regiments of armor in support. So how are they trying to understand how to deal with the British armor?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest answer is they don't deal with it very well, because it provides such a good advantage for them for the Allies over the Japanese. The main responses are, firstly, they have to use their anti-tank weapons at much closer range. So they get very, very good at camouflaging them as well as they can, the use of mines to canalize the tanks into predictable paths that they can then ambush them. So ambush becomes a big part of it. And not just by anti-tank guns, by the way, because a key feature into 1945, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail next week, is also the nature of their attacks become increasingly suicidal. A bit like the kamikaze, there's a similar sort of progression there, regression maybe, depending on how you want to view that. But there is that thing where they get more and more desperate, and so more and more desperate measures come in. And so the attacks go from really, really risky, could get you killed, so they're kind of suicidal, to quite literally suicide tactics. By 1945, the Japanese way to deal with armor is basically to use suicide bombing. And again, I'll talk a bit more next week because it becomes particularly stark in the next one. And you've also got classic things like I brought this image up specifically because it's Molotov cocktails, and also like throwing grenades into the hatches, or and pole charges, lunge mines, that sort of thing.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. Lots of other questions, but let me let others get into it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Mike, we'll go to you. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question, you should be good to go.
Hi, Mike.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. First of all, great talk. And I'm glad you and Robert Lacey are teamed up, because I have great respect for him as well, as an historian. I basically have two questions. The first one is, and they're probably totally unrelated, but the first one is, which you probably know from having done the trek through Holland, there's a problem that where if it's marshy, in other words, if you're restricted to the roads because the sides of the roads won't support tanks because they're marshy, or if they're rice paddies or something like that. To what degree did that limit the British tank, the British
Mobility.
tank in these particular battles?
Yes.
And how vulnerable did it make it? And the second question is, as far as Indian troops, troops from India, from the Indian Army, but who were actually Indian, how much of the tank corps, what percentage did they make up? And we know that Slim was very good, bucking some elements of the British establishment at promoting Indian soldiers when they normally wouldn't have been, but he was basically colorblind as far as that situation goes. So to what degree did they have command positions within the tank corps?
Yes. Okay. So first question then, the big difference between Europe and this particular one is the different seasons. So in the Netherlands, it's an issue of the fact that the water table is very close to the ground, and obviously in some places it's below sea level and that sort of thing. So even at the height of summer, that will not dry out. You know, so September 1944, Market Garden, that they were never going to be going somewhere where the ground was going to be firm. The difference in Burma is, and India as well, and so the Imphal Plain is, because the monsoon season is so horrific, there's normally like operational pauses. So they don't normally fight. And next week I'll talk a bit more about that, but normally they don't fight that much in the monsoon. When they have the dry season, those paddy fields that are like swamps in the monsoon, they go rock hard. And so what you then find is that the little earth bunds that separate rice fields actually are a pain for the tanks, and they wish it was smoother, because the ride is so hard going over each of those little bunds. If they're doing it at speed, it's actually, you know, sort of bone shaking for the crews. So essentially what happens is, because most of the fighting is done in the dry season, the marshy nature of the terrain doesn't really feature into it, to the extent that by 1945, the Third Arakan campaign, they're successfully doing amphibious combined arms operations all along the coast using tanks. And whilst it's a bit difficult offloading them, even in that area, the boggiest part of Burma, basically, they're able to successfully use them, because it's not boggy in the way that, say, driving a 30-ton tank on Dutch polder is, because of the heat, the intensity of the dry season in this part of the world. And the second question was, can you remind me, or Greg remind me?
Well, it was as far as soldiers from India. Indian soldiers.
Yes, yeah, I remember now. So the thing is, Slim's not directly in control of that. He is very good, because you said about Slim and the establishment. It's important to remember Slim is not from that establishment. He's gone to a grammar school, not a private school. You know, his parents were, you know, sort of working class, done well. He got a scholarship to his grammar school, essentially. You know, he is not one of these classic poshos that end up in charge of the British Army a lot of the time, and especially in the sort of the interwar period. He's someone that really had to fight hard for his position to these different places, and he gets treated as a grammar school boy. You know, back then, being a grammar school boy was a mark of you're not one of us at the top. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he is more appreciative and more open to mavericks, or with again different racial groups. So for example, the use of African Indian soldiers and so on. But in terms of the tank corps, because most Indian soldiers had never seen a vehicle before, because a lot of them are rural, and very, very, very old-fashioned rural practices as well, they were assumed to need more training. But actually, an interesting thing, and again, I talk about this in the book, is that they talk about the fact that they take, like, an 18-year-old Indian volunteer takes just as quickly as to an 18-year-old in Britain, who probably also doesn't know how to drive. So there's that whole thing where people assume one thing, but it's actually, the reality is different. But because of the training and the building of the Indian Army, the Indian tank regiments don't really get into action until 1945. So the Deccan Horse, the Probyn's Horse are the big two that I'll talk about next week, because they're big then. The one that does, and I'll skip to the slide that shows them actually, the one that does fight in 1944, and I don't have a great picture of it, but it's A Squadron of the 7th Light Cavalry, because the 7th Light Cavalry is the first former Indian cavalry unit, as in horsed cavalry, who is converted into light tanks. And you can see that slightly old-fashioned thing is that old tanks and cavalry reconnaissance, that sort of thing. And so they were converted into light cavalry, or they were light cavalry reconnaissance, so they went into Stuart tanks as reconnaissance, and they're the first ones, but they still have white British officers. In the tank corps, there aren't any Indian commanders, but there are Indian commanders. The highest rank in the Second World War is Timmy Timayana, who's a brigadier at the end of the war. What you do find, though, is less senior Indian officers are the ones that are in charge of the Indian and Pakistani armed forces in the immediate post-war period as well.
Yes, thank you. And a great talk. Great talk again.
Thank you, Mike. Very kind.
Thanks, Mike. Jack, there's two in the queue. One asks about the role of the Royal Engineers and the, I guess the Royal, it's REME, is that Royal
REME, yeah.
Yeah. Their role in making the ground more hospitable for tanks, given how difficult the environment was.
Yeah. So in the book, I make a really big effort to show how important these guys were, because, and I slightly skipped over it, but things like getting these guys up onto the mountains, this is all about the Royal Engineers doing things like, I said, they're using their bulldozers to literally drag them up the hills. They're also doing things like making corduroy roads. So if you don't know what a corduroy road is, you fell logs and then you lay them down like corduroy clothes, is what it would look like, brown logs in that corrugated shape, so they can get over the ground. And in particular, monsoon ground, like you can see in the background of this image, the monsoon has started. That's one of the reasons we know that it's not Nunshigum, because Nunshigum is still the dry season. A month later, this picture is May, the monsoon has started. Like I said, you always see this on the internet as being from one battle when it's from a different one. But yeah, the Royal Engineers are so important for that, getting the tanks into the right places. There's one sapper that I follow in the book a lot called John Henslow, and he's at the Battle of Kohima, when they're trying to shoot at the different hillsides around. In fact, that map's probably a slightly better one. When they're on this white road that goes around the outside and they're trying to clear the Japanese off there, the Royal Engineers are doing, apart from building ramps with their bulldozers to climb these mountains, or dragging them up, towing them up on the bulldozers, they're also taking things like empty ammunition boxes, filling them with earth and making platforms on the bottom of the valleys so they can get the tank angle right, so that they can fire from the bottom of these valley onto the hillside 100 meters away. And so they're doing all of these different things. I mean, so I know a number of Royal Engineers. I almost was one. They are all about solutions. It's the Royal Engineers that find you the solutions to your battlefield engineering problems. The most obvious one being Bailey bridges. Now, I'll talk a bit more about Bailey bridges next week, because they have a big role then. And Henslow will come up again because he's part of the battle in 1945 as well. But going on to the REME, so for those that don't know the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, they are the ones that are like the mechanics. So they keep all the vehicles going. Now, they're very, very important, because one thing I've slightly skipped over here is the logistical challenges of the Burma campaign. So if I go to one of my maps that I'll actually use next week, I'll do this next week. If you look from Dimapur at the very top here, from roughly where the A in India is, there's a place called Dimapur, which is the supply base. If you're going to Kohima, you have to climb 4,000 foot up into the mountains. You then go down another 3,000 feet to Imphal, or 2,000 feet to Imphal. You then climb another 4,000 feet through the mountains to get to Kalewa, where you drop down again. Okay, and then you have to cross a smaller mountain range to get into the central bit of Burma here. So all of your logistics of getting tanks to any of the places from Kohima onwards are really, really difficult. We're talking switchback roads. Some of you may have heard of the chocolate staircase because of the mud of the S bends. Something like 50 bends on this one mountainside. The Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, they are the ones that have to go to extreme lengths to keep those tanks in combat. And so one particular person that I follow in the book is a guy called Malcolm Connolly. Now, he's one of the drivers of one of these tanks. And he takes his tank up a 9,000 foot or 8,800 foot mountain called Kennedy Peak near Tiddim on the sort of the left hand, the dogleg arrow to Kalewa, going south from Imphal. And they do that after the Royal Air Force have dropped an engine to replace the tank's engine because it's knackered. They drop an engine by parachute. They then fix it that night, replace the engine that night with the Royal with Remy, and then they drive up this mountain the next day. Unfortunately for them, the Japanese had pulled back, so they didn't need the tank in the end. The other really interesting thing that Remy do, and again, sorry if this is a bit jargony, but the echelon system of repairs. So James Holland in Brothers in Arms, if any of you have read that, that's a really good description of this. The echelon system is where, like, you have a small group of basic fixers, like the tank first aid, maybe is a mile behind the front line, and then maybe 5 miles you have a more serious workshop detachment who can actually forge their own replacement parts and things like that. The whole system of Remy in the Burma campaign, because they're desperate to keep the small number of tanks they have as close as they can to the front, they don't want them going back for a week to be repaired. The whole echelon system is basically bumped up one level. So it would have been a mile away and a short drive to get the tank back. They are now basically just behind the front line, by a couple of 100 meters. So the moment that the tank action is ended, they can swarm the tanks and do their repairs and whatever they need to do. And that means that the one that's got serious repairs is brought up to barely a mile away. And so what they generally find, and again, Slim says this in Defeat into Victory, but there are other documents that I found that show the same thing. They generally never were without a tank for 24 hours. Now, a difference in Europe was that they just bring forward a replacement tank, and the old one will be repaired and put back into the system. Burma, they can't have that. So they bring all of the repair that one level closer to the front line.
Did I read in your book they actually thought about or consider bringing in Sherman tanks at one point?
They do get there by 1945, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The interesting thing I didn't mention, actually, this is a crazy, crazy fact. I couldn't believe this when I read this, but in the archives, I found a report where Mountbatten, who's the head of Southeast Asia Command, he wanted experiments done in 1944 as to whether they could take a Sherman tank disassembled in Dakotas and land them, not parachute them, land them on a forward airstrip and then reassemble them at the front, which, like, incredible when you think about it. It shows the outside of the box thinking. Yeah, they could disassemble a tank in 3 aircraft, but the reason they basically knocked it on the head after about 3 weeks of experiments was, firstly, that's too many planes. If you're going to get a regiment of 100 tanks, that's too wasteful with your air power, which is a limited number of aircraft anyway. And obviously the campaign in China is important in that. Chiang Kai-shek demands USAF planes to go back at various times. The other limiting factor was the amount of Remy staff they would need at the forward air base. They would need to be fed by air power, dropping in supplies. They would need to be defended by infantry. That increases the size of the perimeter. There would have to be workshop equipment that would be physically large on the airfield, that would need protecting, all these issues. And so basically they think it's just not practical. It's easier just to keep them at the front line, to be honest. With the Remy stuff, keep them repaired and at the front.
No, it's fascinating. Jim, I know you have a question. There's one more in the queue asking about Slim's use of the radio net as a strategic advantage. Jack, could you briefly maybe touch on that? And then Jim, I'll close out with your, looks like, follow-up question.
Yeah, of course. So the basic thing, and the radios at the disposal of the tanks is really at the biggest advantage in 1942. So um, again, I mean, this is a little hint into my future. My next book is about the 1942 retreat that's coming out in 2027. That is so I'm focusing on 1942. That's the part of the campaign where the radios in the tanks are the most important, because most of the units in Burma in 1942, when the Japanese first invade, very few of them have radios, and it might literally be a battalion has one radio, and that's it. By 1944, it's down to platoon level. And so the tanks become the center of that radio net. And there's a really amazing scene, actually, I talk about Slim using the radio in the back of one of the tank units, lorries in 1942. I won't spoil that. You should read that, but it's one of my favorite scenes that I wrote about. But it was really just about all of that special communication that they had, and also the fact that a tank can see far because it's just physically tall, so they're able to act as their own reconnaissance. An interesting thing, and again, I've relayed this in when I talk about the Battle of Nunshigum, for example. One of the witnesses who's listening at the HQ, listening to the radio chatter and then responding to it, and that sort of thing. So it does give them that advantage of visibility, extra communication at different levels, and that sort of thing.
Oh, fascinating. Jim, if you want to ask your follow-up, you should be good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
It's funny that the person who was in charge of Ballantine Books, the war books production, was a veteran of the CBI. And the question I have is on, you're raising the issue about tank maintenance. I'm very familiar with what goes on in the North African campaign in terms of, learning the hard way about maintaining tanks in the field. So how's that spill over into the operations in Burma, especially after 1942? And just as a, quick, we know this is a big topic, but you just raised the whole question of logistics of that theater, which to me are the big issue strategically. I mean, forget about it, because everybody I knew guys who were in C-47, wings and squadrons flying out of air bases there over the hump and all that. And to me, that was the really interesting part of that theater, how the British overcame, with American help and with Indian help, the issue of strategic issues. But talk about the question of, the interrelationship of theaters and how people learn or not learn lessons of maintaining armor in the field.
So, and the first thing I think is probably worth just mentioning is we have to remember is that in the CB or in India and Burma, so not the entire CBI, but in India and Burma, there's 277,000 Americans. There's only 100,000 British. Nearly 3 times as many Americans. Obviously, 85% of them are Indian, though. There's another 100,000 Africans, East and West Africans. There's 3 cohesive divisions. There's a couple of independent brigades of Africans as well.
Idi Amin.
Yeah. Well, do you know, there's a lot of Indian and African and Pakistani politicians come out of the British Indian Army. Well, the African soldiers are technically British Army, but anyway. So back to your question. So the big lessons that they learn is first the fact that a lot of the tank men who have come over to Burma to be in the 3rd Carabiniers, 25th Dragoons, the Royal 149th, 154th Armored Corps, etc., they have been trained along lines of the lessons learned from sort of 1940, 41, in particular the desert. The 7th Armored Brigade as well, they did actually fight in North Africa for 2 years before 1942. We forget that the Burma campaign starts in 1942, and it's like 3 years into the war for Britain and India, at least. So the lessons in terms of maintenance, they are quite different, because the whole system of repair is much easier in the desert, because you can't, like a drive for half an hour in the desert, you will travel a physically much larger distance than you would do in the Burma campaign, because of the geography and so on. And so the lesson really that they take on is firstly, the importance of having repair close to the front line, but that means very, very physically close in the Burma campaign, rather than, because time is a factor in the desert, say, you don't want to be more than an hour away. In the Burma campaign, time is there, but you also want to make sure that basically that tank is not gone for 4 days. You need it a day later at the latest, because it's a constant worry, especially at the Battle of Imphal. Actually, I didn't mention this. The C Squadron of the 150th Royal Armoured Corps were flown into Imphal, but obviously they're flown in. They were using the reserve tanks for the 3rd Carabiniers as their own. So there were no reserves on the Imphal plain. So if a tank was permanently destroyed, that was it. There was no replacement coming until the Battle of Kohima was resolved and it came up from Dimapur. And obviously that if too many tanks were lost, the worry was there would be no tanks at all. I think the big thing, I mean, just one thing to sort of slightly segue out of your question, but obviously similar, the kind of challenges they had were quite different to the desert. Apart from when they were in the dry belt, which is like the desert, they also have the thing about rubber deteriorating with the constant getting wet and then drying very, very quickly because of the monsoon. Because the monsoon is hot and humid. It's not cold and rainy like it is in Britain half the time. The rubber on the tracks, for example, sealants, that sort of thing. They dry and crack very quickly as they get wet and dry constantly at great speed, because they'll be wet and then dry within an hour in the heat and that sort of thing. So that brings up its own sort of heads as well. But they don't bring loads away because the challenge from North Africa, because the challenges are just so different. The main one just being you need to be close to the front line. How far that is different.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Jack, there's a question in the queue. There are 2 books called Brothers in Arms. Which author are you referring to?
Oh, James Holland.
Oh,
James Holland.
Yeah, I should have answered that one myself.
No problem.
That is our talk for today. Again, thank you to Jack for a great lecture and Q&A. The book is Forgotten Armour, Tank Warfare in Burma. Jack's going to be back next week for an encore performance on his book Thunder Run, Mike Tila, 1945. Jack, do you want to give a brief preview of that talk?
Yes, yeah. So it is my pitch for this is the greatest combined arms battle you've never heard of. Because it is the one that really finishes the Japanese in Burma in this campaign. There is a simultaneous battle at Mandalay, which is part of the story, but my focus is very much on Mekhtila because it was such an amazing battle. I'd like to do a book on Mandalay at some point as well, because the general in charge at Mandalay, guy Pete Rees, is an absolute legend. If you don't like, I do a chapter on Mandalay in Forgotten Armour, and I do a chapter on Mekhtila in Forgotten Armour. But the story was so good at Mekhtila, I had to do it as a full book, and not just the tanks. I do the infantry, air, and that sort of thing. It's a more broad battle narrative. And yeah, I want people to read it and kind of just realize basically that, it's not just Europe and the Eastern Front for big combined arms, sweeping entrapment things. I put it on a History Rage podcast. I said that the operation is blitzkrieg adjacent.
Oh, wow.
If things like Patton or Monty, Zhukov, Guderian, if they had done this operation, everybody would know about it. There would be dozens and dozens of books. There have only been a handful of books on this, and some of them are not very good, to be honest. They just literally do this happened on this day, this happened on this day. Both my books, what I like to try and do is weave together the eyewitness accounts, but everything is triangulated with the records, memoirs, audio recordings, all of the different things. And sort of my general rule of thumb is I only really write about things if I find 2 sources that say it. And also the unreliability of witnesses. In Thunder Run in particular, there is a particular unreliable witness who I sort of, as politely as I can, kind of just say to the reader, look, that he says one thing, but it's actually this that happened. And interestingly, Rob Lyman knew the guy personally who's now passed away. But awkward thing to think about. But the story was good, including the fact that he wasn't entirely honest. And I'm a historian. I'm not here to just repeat legends. I did the digging and found the truth, if you see what I mean. I admire I know why the guy did what he did in The Lie, but he it's still a lie at the end of the day. But I still respect the guy, and maybe that's something I can say for next week.
Yeah, no, definitely looking forward to it. Yeah, same time next week, and looking forward to that discussion. Sounds like it's going to be fascinating. Thanks everyone for joining us, and Jack, we will see you back here in about a week. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.
See you next week.
Thank you.